My name is Stuart Elden. I'm a professor of political theory and geography at the University of Warwick. Welcome to my exp. Michel Foucault was born in 1926 in Poitiers, and after the Second World War he moved to Paris to begin his studies. He studied both philosophy and psychology, and then when he qualified to teach, his initial teaching posts were to teach psychology to philosophy students. He had a few years outside of France teaching literature and running cultural programs in Uppsala, Warsaw and Hamburg, and then held posts both in France, Tunisia, a visiting post in Brazil, and many return visits to North America, particularly to California, where he taught often philosophy or the history of philosophy, but his work was often historical in terms of how he approached his topics. His books include histories of madness, of clinical medicine, of the human sciences, of the history of the prison and the punitive society more generally, and then his last great project, the unfinished history of sexuality that he was working on at the time of his death. Foucault engages with the question of power throughout his work, although it's only really explicitly theorized in the 1970s and through into the 1980s. Foucault is interested in rethinking the way that power can be understood, but also to try and analyse how power actually operates within contemporary societies and his historical examples. Foucault challenges the way that we have traditionally understood power within political theory. Foucault has a great line where he says that in political thought and analysis, we have still not cut off the head of the king. For a French audience, of course, this refers to the way that the French king had been guillotined. But Foucault says that we're still thinking about power as if the king is still in that place, that we still think about power being centralised in society. We think about it flowing one direction from the top down over people, that we tend to think of power as repressive. But Foucault says actually we need to think about power in a different way than this. It's not that power doesn't work in those ways, but that power doesn't only work in those ways. Power, Foucault says, can be understood as power relations, an exchange of power relations that go on within society, that flow in many directions, that are not centralised, but are dispersed throughout society and its institutions. Power is also productive rather than simply repressive, and a lot of Foucault's later work is exploring different ways in which power can shape individuals through their own choices, through their own way of working, rather than it simply being something that is dictated to them by institutions or figures in power over them. Discipline and Punish is probably the most read and the most cited of Foucault's books. It's a book that begins with two startling images. The first one is the image of the execution or the torture and execution of Damiens, somebody who had tried to kill the French king. And it goes into quite graphic detail about what they did to the body of this man as he was tortured in a public display and then executed. And then Foucault shifts to the House of Young Prisoners, only about 80 years later, where the prisoners have their time and the space of the place that they are incarcerated very carefully controlled. So he says that on the first drumbeat they need to get out of bed, on the second drumbeat they need to be ready at the end of bed with the bed made and ready for the day. And so it's a very clear compartmentalisation of their time, an organisation of the space within this institution. And Foucault says, how did we get from one to the other? How did we move from this spectacular display of sovereign power on the body of this condemned man to this organisation and this regulation of time and space in the prison? And Foucault says, well, how do we understand this? So he goes into a lot of detail of trying to understand these questions, these transitions. And it's really the work where Foucault most explicitly engages with the question of power. He talks about power in other works, but this is the work in his Intellectual Chronology, the book was published in 1975, where he's most explicit in thinking about the question of power. And here he's challenging the idea that we should simply think about power in terms of sovereign power, centralised power, the domination of a king, of an emperor, of a president, of a political class. He's thinking about how power is dispersed throughout society, whether it's in a prison, whether it's in a factory, in a school, in a hospital, in some other kind of institution. Foucault is certainly interested in the question of freedom and the question of how we might be able to resist the use of power over us. He talks about the way that if you look at where power is operating, that is the point where power needs to operate. That is the place where power needs to direct its forces. And this, then, he says, is the place where resistance is possible. He certainly says that there are instances where resistance isn't possible. If somebody's in chains and they're entirely unable to move, then this would mean an example where power is so dominant that really he's not particularly interested in exploring that. But he says that many other instances, this is the place where there is resistance. We can understand Foucault's work in Discipline and Punish, which is an academic historical book that is looking at these kinds of questions, very much understood it in terms of the political struggles that Foucault was involved with in the first part of the 1970s. With other figures, Foucault had founded what was known as the Prison Information Group, which was about the condition largely in French prisons, of trying to understand what it was that was actually going on behind the walls of those closed institutions. And they used this by talking to prisoners' families, talking to some of the people that had worked in prisons, either prison guards or prison psychologists and others, to try to expose what was happening in French prisons.